Today we're going to continue our look at operations for model railroads with a look this time at schedules. Because in my overview I talked a lot about schedules and the importance of schedules and the fact that everything on a railroad ran by schedule. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, before we get started, I want to ask you to take a second to subscribe. Click on the subscribe box, and when that comes up, click on the little bell right next to it and click all. Okay, so before we do jump into this, let me go ahead and give you a look at some actual prototype literature that can be quite useful for planning your operations on your model railroad. Now, first off, this is a Southern Railway rule book, and it's designed, it has all of the operating rules for the Southern Railway in 1956. It was released August the 1st, 1956, and it covers all of the various operating rules, lots of other information, things like, color signals, what they meant, yard limits, let me show you. Here's a diagram showing semaphores, and there's several pages of this, of what each semaphore signal meant. And here's some more semaphore signals, and also a list of abbreviations. And that list of abbreviations continued onto the next page. And these are the kind of abbreviations that would be used when, talking with the station agent or between the agent and the dispatcher and the like, because they did abbreviate a lot of things. They had a lot of communicating to do, and so they used a lot of abbreviations to shorten things and make things clear. So like right off, there's OS. That means a train report, okay? So the station agent might call the dispatcher and tell him that train 29 OS 1 p.m. And that means that train 29 just passed through at 1 p.m. And OS meant that it was on the sheet or on the schedule at 1 p.m. And so there's a whole lot of these type of abbreviations that were used as part of railroading. What else is in here? Various trackside signals and the like, or signs here, and what they meant. So you've got this one here that is very common. It's a long, short, long whistle indication that telling the train engineer to blow that sequence of blast on his horn or his whistle because a crossing was coming and he needed to warn vehicles along the right-of-way that a train was approaching. And there's just several pages of this. And then there are several pages of what the color light signals meant, various blank forms, and there are a lot of people that use railroad forms as part of their operating sessions. And then there's a section here at the end that describes the jobs of each employee on the railroad. So if you ever want a complete description of how a railroad operated, pick up a copy of one of these for the prototype railroad that you're interested in and the era that you're interested in. These come up on eBay all the time. You can buy them at Railroadiana shows that might occur in your area once COVID is over with. I got this one off of eBay, for about $10. So there's a lot of good, interesting information in here for the prototype that you might be interested in. And every railroad had their own version of these operating rules. Now, another thing that's very useful to have when planning your trains and operations are these passenger schedules. So what these had then, listings of all of the trains operated on the railroad. And there's just page after page of these. It gives you a full schedule for each one, tells you about them a little bit. And then down here on the bottom, there's something very useful for planning. It has a list of all the cars that ran in that train and the type of cars, whether or not they were stainless steel streamlined cars or the older heavyweight cars. So if you want to replicate the operations of your favorite prototype or favorite train, this is one resource that you can dig out. Now, they don't have anything in here about freight trains. This is just passenger trains, but these are readily available, again, on eBay. They come up all the time. I've got several years of these for the Southern Railway. This one happened to be 1957, my operating year. Another thing that's very useful are these employee timetables. So these are the timetables that are produced for the employees. So employees would know when trains were running. And these are very important because they contain all of the information about the trains being run on that particular division. So this is the Washington Division for starting in September 1954. And, you know, it didn't change that much between 54 and 57, probably 54 and 64. So I'm using this one to go by for my operations on the model railroad, and I've compared it to schedules for 1957, and it's the same. Okay, might be a difference of a minute or two. But what's important here is, like I said, it has a list of all of the stations in the division. It gives you distances. It gives you the station number and mile. It gives you things like the time that the train passes through that particular station. So if you want to plan your operations to match those of the prototype, you've got a layout for every station, the relative distance apart, the times that trains took to go from one station to another. So for planning your model railroad, these are just indispensable if you want to follow prototype practice. Now, of course, if you don't really want to model an actual prototype portion of a railroad, one thing you can use these for is at least planning your operations on your railroad, because you might decide that you want to scale it down quite a bit, or you might actually just want to have a different freelanced railroad that follows the operating schedules or follows the operating practices of the prototype. You know, David Barrow was very famous for his Cat Mountain and Santa Fe Railroad, which followed Santa Fe operating practices. So you could do something like that, but you need that information to set up to operate like the prototype. And this is one way to get it. Now, another thing that's very interesting about this is it lists the classifications of every train, because trains were broken down according to how much priority they were given. So a first-class train would be a passenger train in most cases, but on the Southern, it also included a lot of their most important freight trains. And so they were given the highest priority in the scheduling. And then you would have a listing also, let me get this out here. And as you can see, there are listings for first class, second class, and third class trains here. So it gives you the breakdown of the movements and the schedule by train classification and priority. And that, you know, allowed everyone to know who had priority. Because on railroads, the higher the priority determined the priority that that train would get in meets and in departures and in all the other manners of handling of that train. And like I said, typically on the Southern, that meant first class was your passenger trains. Your second class would have been lower rated or lower priority freight trains in most cases. Now, some other interesting things that these schedules include are various special instructions for operations, and they can be very important because they give a lot of very important information. So like here, they list the locations of all of the standard clocks within the division, and also they tell you where there are veterinarians on service to the railroad, under contract to the railroad, to provide service. Maximum speed restrictions in various portions of the division. All kinds of other things like that. Types of locomotives that can be operated between certain areas on the railroad, because there were some sections of the Southern branch lines in particular that were limited by weight and class. They had information here like locomotive ratings for different areas. So for example, between Monroe and Charlottesville, you could only pull 1,500 tons per diesel locomotive in a consist. So that limited the number of cars that you could run. For a conductor and an engineer, that was very important because they didn't want a train stalling out halfway between Monroe and Charlottesville because they had overloaded the train. So the question is, how do you go about using something like this? Well, let me give you some tips here. So one thing you can do is you can create your own schedules. So this is a schedule for the Southern Railway. It's dated July 16th, 1956. And this is for the Washington Division, Danville Division as well. And it is my friend Bill Cox's model railroad. Bill lives up near Lynchburg, Virginia in Amherst and models that section of the railroad as well. So he's developed his own timetable identical to that I just showed you for the Southern Railway. And that's what he uses for operating his model railroad. Okay? And he has a lot of other things in here, information about various forms that he uses during operating sessions, car cards, all of that. And here on the back, a diagram of the stations along the right-of-way on the model railroad. Another fellow, Norm Stenzel, who used to work for TCS until he retired a few years ago. Norm's railroad was the Brandywine and Benedictine. And here he has done a complete operating manual, just like the Southern one that I just showed you, with all of the same kinds of information. If you look, you can see he's even replicated a page on signals and what the different signals mean. And he's got all of that other information here in the back. He even has the job descriptions for the various employees on the model railroad. So that's one thing you could do. He also developed his own schedule. So you can see one sheet that has all of the trains, the times, and the locations all laid out here. So these can be used for the dispatcher to dispatch trains and control train movements during an operating session. Now, another thing that he has on the back here, I call a string diagram. And these are very, very useful, and I'm going to show you how to make one of these up. In my case, one thing I've been able to do is, because I do have the Southern's 1954 schedule, I was able to go through here and adjust the schedule to what I wanted a little bit and tweak it. And I already have a schedule to go with for the Piedmont Southern. Now, naturally, once I start running trains, I'm probably going to find out that my times and their times are a little bit different. And so I'm ready to make adjustments to all of my times in the schedule. And that's something that, it's just reality. But at least this gives me a starting point for designing operations on the Piedmont Southern, because I've got all the trains that need to be run and how they ran on the prototype. So I have a schedule for all of the trains that were run, the different classes that they were run as, and their priorities, the whole 9 yards. Everything that I want to do as far as scheduling trains and operating the model railroad is encompassed right here in this employee timetable that I'm modifying. But one thing you can do is develop a string diagram like that one here I just showed you for Norm Stenzel's layout. And the way you can do that is, first, let me show you. This is one that I did back in the early 1990s for the Northern Virginia Model Railroader layout in Vienna, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. And it modeled the Southern Railway. It was focused mainly on the North Carolina section. Okay, so it started here in Spencer, North Carolina, and went up to Asheville, North Carolina, with all of the stations in between here. And then I had the time. We started the schedule at 8 a.m. and went to 8 p.m. Now, there's 8 p.m. This was a 24-hour schedule. We were working real fast. We were, I think, running about we would run this schedule in 2 hours. So, what's that, 12 to 1 schedule? That was fast. Nobody runs 12 to 1 anymore. During an operating session then, your dispatcher would use a schedule like this to give orders to each train, and we'll talk about communications later, but he would communicate orders to each train based on this schedule, telling them, when they could leave and when they couldn't, okay, when they had to wait in order for a meet. So that's one way that you can use schedules to govern your movement of your trains. Now, of course, the other thing would be to use the string diagrams like I've shown you, because the dispatcher can sit with a string diagram there in front of them and just trace the movement, because he has the position of each train here, or each station anyway, and the time that each train should be going through it. And then he's got time right here. So that's how you would go about using these string diagrams. And you can take a magic marker, a yellow marker, and just run a line right over top of these so that you can follow the movements of the trains as they move along. And you can actually plan when you're going to run any given train or delay one based on the schedule and how everybody else is operating. And that's also how you use these for planning extras and movements of extra trains. Because, you know, the dispatcher has to be able to run a train up through this mess of lines somewhere. And by actually looking at the string diagram, you can see gaps in the overall schedule where you could insert an extra train. So let me show you how you go about setting one of these up. Well, first off, you go into a program like Excel. You use a spreadsheet program or a table program, and you create a table like this, okay, with your various station names along the y-axis and the hours. And this one here is set up from 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. plus an hour afterwards, in case you run over. And so you've got distance here and time here, okay? And then what you do is you get a train out and you run it across your model railroad going from each one to each one of these stations. And you measure the time that it takes for that train to go from North Staging to Charlottesville, and Charlottesville to Arrowhead, and then to Red Hill and Rockfish, and on down through the entire list of stations, okay? And then you just mark that on there. And then you go back through, and with each train that you want to operate, you're going to indicate the starting time by putting a dot right there at the point, okay? So if I wanted this train, my first train, to start in North Staging at 12 a.m., I would put a dot there. And then if I wanted to arrive in Charlottesville at 12:15, I put a dot there, okay? And you go on down through the schedule here, advancing in time as you go over the division. And then you go back afterwards and you draw a line connecting all of those dots. And then you do that for every train that you're going to be running. And what you're going to come up with is something that looks like this. So this is the entire operating schedule for the Piedmont Southern between 12 a.m. and 1 p.m. plus a little for extra time to overrun the schedule, okay? And so what I've got then is every one of my trains, you know, and one thing that you'll note here, note that train 29, this one here, starts off and it moves down in this direction. Train 38 begins down here in the south end and goes in this direction. So it's going north, this one's going south. Now, one thing about train numbers on the Southern Railway, odd number trains were southbound, even number trains were northbound. And that was true. North and eastbound were even, south and westbound were odd numbers, okay? So right off, your employees have a way of knowing which direction they should be going. Okay? Now, that also helps the dispatchers keep track of trains as well. Another thing here that's important to note is the slope of this line. Because you essentially have distance here and time here, the slope of this line gives you the speed of the train because it's miles per hour, okay? So that gives you a good feeling of how fast your trains are moving across the division. Now, in your planning, that's very important because you want things to run at a prototypical speed. Now, you'll note that on this one, train 29, once it gets to Charlottesville, it arrives there a little after 12:30, and it sits there until about 12:45, and then it proceeds on south. and it goes through Red Hill about 1 p.m. So right off, that tells you something about operations. Anytime that you have a train that's going to be sitting anywhere, you just draw a line across. And then that's the departure point right there, and it moves on down. Now some of these have long lines where that they have longer periods of sitting. This up here, the rock train, starts, goes out, sits and does work in the quarry, and then comes back at 12 p.m. that night, okay? So you can use that as part of your planning process. Make sure that you schedule all of these things in here. Now another neat thing here that I'll show you. Notice that at several points, these northbound and southbound trains cross. Now, on the Piedmont Southern, because it's a double-track main line, that's not really an issue for me because the trains can pass on opposite tracks and just wave as they go by, and it's not an issue. But on a lot of model railroads, and a lot of railroads in general, you would have long stretches of single-tracked main line with a station and a passing track at some location along the way. And so anytime that you've got two trains that are going to cross like this, that indicates the need for a meet, because you don't want them meeting somewhere out there in the middle of the cornfield with only one track, because somebody's going to get hurt. So what you would do is you would arrange these crosses to occur at places where there was a station with a passing siding, or there might be a passing siding somewhere on one of these long stretches of single track. And so that's one thing you have to plan for is, and use these string diagrams, is to locate areas where you've got potential conflicts and move the time sequence around so that you do not have any unplanned cornfield meets. So those are some of the things that you can use these kind of string diagrams for. And actually, if you do one of these first on your railroad, then you have, for every train that you want to run, arrival and departure times all along your scheduled route. And you can then go back and use those string diagrams to create a schedule like this one. Because for each train, like here, train 29, which is that first one that I showed you on my schedule, you have all the arrival and departure times along the route. So that's how you go about creating a schedule for model railroad operations. For any of you that are interested, I will place copies of the string diagram that I've been talking about and one of the schedules, the model schedules that I showed you. And those will be on my website, and if you go to the description that accompanies this video, it will give you the website address, and you can go there and just click on the file name and you'll be able to download it. Okay? So that's a wrap for today's video on developing your own operating schedules for model railroads. And in the next video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how you go about planning the shipping of freight cars on a model railroad and off of the model railroad. In the meantime, have a good week, and we'll see you here with another video from the DCC Guide. Bye now.